Let's return to the 90s. Back then, 3D platformers dominated the gaming industry with the likes of Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, and of course, Crash and Spyro. Whether it be the simplicity of jumping and collecting in a 3D environment or playing as a mascot character, they heralded a simpler time, unlike today where most games go for a more cinematic appeal. Well, that transitions into my next point. For by the time the 2000s rolled around, that era of 3D platformers ended. Well, maybe not necessarily ended, but they no longer had the same status as they did before. Not meaning to repeat myself from my Jak 2 review, but times were changing, and the people that once loved the color-saturated games of jumping and collecting items were desiring something more mature, realistic, and with games like Metal Gear Solid 2, thought-provoking. Although I think there were other issues like 3D platformers being difficult to make, or game design flaws like an overabundance of mini-games and collecting things that hampered the experience. Genres like first-person shooters and sandbox titles had more appeal during this period, and I don't think it's fair to say all these were generic and copy and paste like Call of Duty. You had some decent ones like the Time Splitters trilogy. Also, I don't think it's 100% accurate to say they killed the 3D platforming genre. Maybe games like Sly Cooper underperformed in terms of sales, but they still came out in droves in the 2000s era. Albeit, they did attempt to evolve in order to adapt to the changing times to appeal to the masses. So you had Ratchet & Clank focus more on gunplay over the platforming and collecting, or with the appeal of Metal Gear Solid, Sly Cooper tried to put an emphasis on stealth and film noir elements. Genre blending was very common in order to get back the attention of the more grown-up audience, and of course, you had like Jak 2, which did a complete 180. But along came Vexx, which proved that even the familiar 90s 3D platforming formula had the capability to reach out to an audience that had otherwise grown weary of the genre. In fact, to quote Thomas Cole from the now-defunct Acclaim Entertainment, the name Vexx kind of evolved out of the notion of this cursed soul trying to turn things around and put the bad luck on his enemies instead, which sends the conception the protagonist is out with a vengeance and the narrative having more thematic elements. In the same vein, Cole also stated that he wanted the game to focus more on combat, hoping that it will provide more variety to the players, which is also a next-level notion, considering that other 3D platformers saw it as an afterthought. So whether Acclaim was aware of it or not, they were taking Vexx in a new direction, away from the more endearing elements of 3D platformers, into darker territory, while still maintaining the root core gameplay of running and jumping. So yeah, Vexx. Is it a bona fide classic, or does it fall into the same trap as Jak 2? And try a little too hard to be dark and edgy, to the point that it's alienating to the general 3D platforming audience. On second thought, I think I'd go with bona fide classic. Man, the worst thing you can do is do a review while at gunpoint. But in all seriousness, Vexx does seem to take a different direction compared to other 3D platformers, and that cannot be more evident than in the presentation. So Vexx opens with a narration of a character named Irena, who recounts out of pride of her people caused the opening of a door upon Astara, unleashing the Shadow Wraiths. Attacking several villages, they eventually invaded Vexx's home, Overwood. Though Vexx and his grandfather Fargus made a conceited effort in order to fight the Shadow Wraiths, they were overpowered and taken into custody as slaves. The labor proved too much for Vexx, to the point he lashed out and tried to attack his oppressors, only to be stopped by the Shadow Lord Yabu, who nearly killed Vexx if Fargus hadn't intervened. Enraged, Vexx boarded Yabu's ship, wanting to find a means for revenge. Instead, he found two Astani war talents which fused to his hands. From there, Vexx must trek across Astara in order to avenge Fargus, who happens to be still alive just barely, since Yabu feeds on his fear and despair. Just wow. For a 3D platformer, this feels like more than what I expect. CGI cutscenes, as compressed as they are, almost present a cinematic feel that reflects the epic of a Greek Odyssey. The narrative itself may seem like a simple save-the-world plot, however, it manages to reflect a sense of despair. Vexx develops the stakes by basically establishing in the intro cutscene that the enemy has won and the hero needs to climb his way out of defeat. Already, the opening presents questions. Who is the narrator? What kind of pride caused the rift to open? That's right, the narrator herself is set up as a major character in the game. Initially, you can read her diaries from the inventory. However, in the middle of the game, she becomes more prominent. So in many ways, Vexx uses the lore to develop a character even before we meet her, which is a type of narrative we don't really see much in video games. And then there's the caricature of the silent protagonist. So it usually is the case that 3D platformers often have the protagonist not be able to speak, so you are forced to rely on their facial animations to detect any sense of character. Vexx takes this to a whole new level because the facial expressions aren't just there to make him out to be a spunky, entertaining hero, they actually make him out to be defiant, but at the same time lonely. Some of these expressions make it out as if Vexx is alone, unsure of his own destiny or what is going on. So he isn't just pure rage and hateful revenge. Of course, there's some of that too, but also one that is kind of like an underdog questioning his purpose. Generally speaking, it doesn't just make him a relatable character, but also one with some dimensions. I mean, this is the guy that went through a beating at the hands of some dark spirits, then watched his grandpa die. Like, this literally is not kid stuff. In fact, compared to the simplicity of Mario, Crash, and Spyro, Vexx has a more vulnerable, dare I say, defeated kind of status. His story is basically like Odysseus, in which he needs to regain the glory that he lost. But then again, I've forgotten most of my Greek mythology from 10th grade. Take fucking that, Mrs. S. The only other character that deserves mentioning is Darby. Now, the game actually does a pretty good job at hiding the twist that happens in the climax. They initially make him out to be such an innocent man who's blind, and the way Vexx defends the guy, he really does come across as frail and old. But what do they always say? Appearances are deceiving? Yeah, there are little hints like how he knows more about the Shadow Wraiths than Vexx does.
Careful. Shadow Wraiths are shape changers. Trust no one along your journey. Wraiths are like cockroaches, nearly impossible to kill.
So it makes you go, maybe he was just a really powerful warrior that got his bum whooped a long time ago. But no, he's actually the main antagonist from the game. And honest to God, the first time I played this, I really couldn't see this coming. It's probably one of the biggest twists ever in a game's plot. So despite how simply they present him, the game implies that there's more to Darby than meets the eye without saying it directly. And I guess I could talk about Rhea. Like I said earlier, you never meet her until the middle of the game. However, the diary paints such an intriguing story that it often led me to want to collect the next journal to see what would happen next. These aren't just simple documents detailing her childhood. Reyna herself has a tale that, while separate from the game, kept me as engaged as the main plot. Take a listen to this.
Dark Yabu is alive. He's built a fortress in the far reaches of Astara's ruins. In some twisted way, his citadel actually lives, and has sucked the energy out of the world around it like a parasite. The land nearby has become even more desolate and cold than it already was. Strangely, the thought of Yabu living consoles me. Perhaps if he survived, some of my own people may live yet somewhere. I now have a quest. I will show Yabu the same mercy he showed my family.
Usually with these kinds of journals, the said character is either absent from the main story, or if you're Kingdom Hearts, you're already established. However, Rhea is interesting because how you see her changes depending on if you've read the journals. You won't have the backstory to understand her motives, and she might come across as another character that shows up out of the blue. But with the journals, you get more insight into these things, and it makes you ask lots of questions. That's something that Vexx does really well. making you curious about the plot even in-game. As you journey throughout the levels, sometimes you'll hear the whispers of what seems to be of the village's past. For instance, in the Neverglades level, there is a moment where it sounds like a wife is assuaging her husband of some kind of foreboding. Of course, this could mean just about anything. It could be that he needs to get off his ass and go to work, or it could mean something far darker. So the world around you contains hidden details of the story. Usually the story and gameplay tend to be separate entities in video games. However, Vexx differs from this by the mere fact that the story plays a part by not only creating a structure for the game, but also augmenting the atmosphere. And speaking of atmosphere, the graphics and environment supplement the game beautifully. Vexx isn't like other 3D platformers that often have generic jungles and castles. Many of the environments in Vexx seem to be derived from fantasy-like worlds. Some of the things that really grabbed me included the asteroid field that can be seen in the distance. It prevents the game from feeling like this is just another forest level, and make Astara stand out from anything you'd see in real life. However, there are other designs that stood out as well. For instance, in Tempest Peak Manor, the level centers around Vexx traveling inside of a house in a miniature size. Some of the details Acclaim puts in here to make the entire simple room seem like a hostile place includes the dog stalking around on the floor. Basically, it's another one of those levels where the floor is lava and you need to do what you can to avoid it. This hound at the bottom of the floor doesn't just walk around. From time to time, depending on where you are, he'll start lunging towards your position as if he's waiting for you to fall into his mouth. For the most part, Vexx's levels kind of remind me of Psychonauts to a certain extent. And here's another obscure one, Crush for the PSP. The thing with both of these games is that they actually have a reason to be obscure, considering you are traveling in the depths of someone's mind. However, here in Vexx, this is what their world resembles. I mean, just take a look at some of these wacky designs. As for the music, the use of orchestral music is something I'm not used to in 3D platformers. It really does provide a cinematic feel to the game. The OST to Temperdale opens Vexx's adventure with horns playing, as if to signify the hero was starting on a daring quest. But at the same time, there are flutes playing as if to notify that there is some uncertainty in his mission. On the other hand, you have the musical level in Tempest Peak Manor, in which sometimes you'll hear musical notes every time you die. The voice acting, for what little it is generally pretty good. Brian Cox deceives the audience by giving Darby an old, rusty geezer voice, so when the twist happens, it catches you by surprise when he reverts to a more sinister tone for Yabu.
So proud, so regal, so
Kate Christian makes Soraya first start out as an innocent girl in the journals, but eventually she turns into a hardened PTSD woman, and the anger and frustration in her voice reflects the pain and sorrow she's experienced.
Failed. Without the key staff, we can't close the rift. But all hope is not lost. You can get it back.
And then you have Vexx himself. Now, similar to Jak and Daxter, the Purser legacy, Vexx uses grunts to communicate emotion. But unlike Jak, these grunts aren't simply relegated to gameplay. Instead, they speak volumes as to what he's going through in the present moment.
Rage became unbearable. He lashed out, attacking his oppressors, but
For what little that these grunts do, they are quite effective in displaying the turmoil inside of him that displays, as the manual says, a boy that had his childhood stolen from him. As little as these grunts are, Vexx isn't just your typical silent protagonist. But now we finally come to what is quite possibly the most important aspect of a game, which is none other than, you guessed it, the gameplay. Or is it? Take your pick, but in my opinion, the gameplay is one of the most vital elements. If you were to look at a sandwich, the roast beef would be the gameplay, while everything else is the bread, lettuce, and tomatoes. I guess that's why I leave it out for last. Vexx is basically a collectathon platformer akin to Croc, Legend of the Gobos, or Spyro the Dragon. The main collectible you'll be picking up are the Wraith Hearts, which are used to power the different rift gates, powering the different worlds of Astara. You might be thinking, oh, this sounds like Jak and Daxter, collecting hearts by accomplishing tasks. Well, there are very small differences. As mentioned many times before, Vexx makes use of a fantasy-like world, and the game itself tries to demonstrate that in the game, so many of the tasks will often involve some kind of riddle you have to solve in order to get the collectible. So for instance, one of the riddles will talk about playing a game and a heart jumping out of the screen. It makes you go, what the fuck does that mean? But then you realize that one of the tasks literally has you go on top of a controller and play a game of pinball. Like a video game within a video game. It's one of those things you expect will have you wandering around, making you frustrated. But then you finally solve it, you realize, oh, I see how that fits. Another example is how they talk about building a tiki idol, to which they say some construction is required. What's that supposed to mean? This game never taught me how to build anything. But then you realize there's a bunch of idol heads scattered around in Everglades, and you have to put them back onto tikis. And it makes you go, oh. And sometimes these tasks will introduce a gimmick to the core gameplay. There's a room where you have to monkey bar your way on a ceiling made of water. Another involves you constantly flipping perspectives while also inverting the controls in order to reach some platforms. It's little touches like these that makes Vexx a distinguishable platform, unlike others that might simply tell you to climb a tower. Besides the hearts, you also have the shards and spirit jars that also serve as collectibles. Collect 100 shards in 6 jars, you get a Wraith Heart, kind of similar to how Crash Bandicoot has you breaking every box to get a gem. Although it's kind of interesting to see how the game fits these collectibles into the mythos, like how the jars hold the spirits of fallen warriors who had defeated Shadow Wraiths. It makes it feel like Acclaim Entertainment wove the gameplay and the narrative worlds together instead of having something like Wampa Fruits and make them just a gameplay aspect without explaining what or where they came from. Sometimes the game world also requires there to be some kind of interaction with the environment in order to activate access points. Numerous levels contain a sundial that allows you to change the time of day in a level. Depending on where the sun sits, it might activate a portal which allows you to go through a secret area of the level. These often test your platforming skills, with platforms that might expand and shorten at a whim, or jumping across poles while floating over the void. I always kinda liked how these stages took place in the middle of the void. It always gave a sense that this was some unknown area, just discovered. Or how about in one level where you had to open a chest for several pirates? Seriously, I kept wondering where the code for this was. According to the riddle, it was inside a book. So I kept looking around the whale, trying to figure out where the book was. Apparently, it was in the manual. Ha! Clever. And then, of course, finally there's the combat. It's nothing too complex. You have the ordinary square button attack to slash enemies. You can also perform an uppercut to knock enemies into air and also a ground pound. The uppercut can require some skill to use, considering that knocking them in the air will allow you to increase the amount of points you obtain indicated in the upper right. Once you get enough, you'll be able to go into a super-powered form that allows you to deal energy blasts that kill enemies in one hit. It may not be anything too big, but the sound effects go a long way in making the combat cathartic. It really does make you want to go over there and punch the shit out of your enemies. But you know, man, You've been talking about all the positive things about Vexx. Why don't you try to be a little bit more fucking critical, for once? Well, if I were to go fucking critical, that guy over there would slice me to pieces. And, well, I don't really have too much to say on that subject. Oh, come on, man. This is a review. Just think about your audience. Like, you're supposed to be talking about both the good and the bad things. Alright, fine. So in this section of the review, we'll be talking about the negatives and criticisms I have towards Vexx, such as the camera! Wait, what? Not you. The game camera. Yeah, the camera generally was very problematic as I played through the game. I think the main issue had a lot to do with the fact that it got stuck behind objects every time I tried to go through tight corridors. Take the ice cave section in Frostblight Mill. Because of all the ice crystals scattered around the cave, the camera would get stuck behind the objects and stop following Vexx. This was especially frustrating by the fact that you had to navigate your way using the magma rock form in order to smash into a sheet of ice to get a Wraith Heart. Since the camera was so unwieldy and you can only have the magma suit for a limited time, this issue really reared its head with sections like these. And then there are also the times where the camera is stuck in a fixed position, making it difficult to judge jumps from platforms. And you constantly want to recenter it behind Vexx, but it utterly refuses to move. There are plenty of examples of this, but it can make the platforming frustrating at times. Another issue I had included the swimming underwater parts. Swimming underwater with the Vexx can feel a bit awkward at times, depending on how hard or lightly you push the square button. Vexx will either swim really quickly or slow down. The main problem with this is because of the floating nature of the water, sometimes Vexx will struggle to move in a straight line. This became especially egregious with the part in Dragon Reach where you had to swim underwater in order to activate several cubes. Swimming straight into the cubes proves to be very difficult for Vexx, as he would sometimes approach the cube to the side or go diagonally into a wall. Considering that he only has a limited amount of breathing time, also caused this to be my first ever game over. But then I learned you can pop oxygen bubbles to increase Vexx's breathing capacity. Well, I was never known for my intelligence. And some of the other issues I had with the game are just 5th generation problems. One thing that really got me was why every time Vexx collected a Wraith Heart, it was sent back to the time portal. I guess maybe the developers didn't want you to be finishing the level too quickly, but I always thought it was kind of redundant having to do all that trekking after I collected a Wraith Heart. And I guess another thing is that this game has quite the difficulty curve. The difficulty does spike around the 5th or 6th world. Still didn't stop me from getting to the end, though. When I finally got to the final boss, I was ready to give it a final hurrah. Only to realize that Dark Yabu was as hard as trying to hit a circle into a square peg. Yeah, it's a 3-stage fight. The first stage is not so hard, although the part where he throws fireballs while the shadows attack you did cause a few deaths. The only part that really got on my tits was the second stage, where he turns into this spider thing. Of the numerous new attacks he throws at you, the worst is when he slams his forearms on the ground that causes a shockwave. Good God, I probably had more game overs to this boss than I can count at the entirety of the game. So I died, and died, and died. And it's back to the beginning every time you lose. There are many times when I was tempted to call it quits, but nay, I said. I've beaten Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix on critical mode. I won't succumb to this spider. And well, I eventually did beat him. To which my reaction was basically, oh my god, thank God I was able to do it. Oh, it feels so satisfying. Oh, I thought I was going to die like 100 times, but oh my god, thank God I was able to do it. Got rewarded to the cinematic CGI cutscene of Vexx running down the corridor while the Shadow Realm is crumbling. Rhea gives her own narration.
I guess we all make mistakes. Perhaps the only thing worse than failing is the fear of failing.
Practically the story of my life. Supposedly he sacrifices his life, but he emerges out of the pit, ready to fight another day. And you know how Psychonauts ended with a cliffhanger that never got answered until years later? Well, it's kind of like that, except we never got answers as to whether Vexx escapes or not. It's a little bit unsatisfying. Like, I was kind of wondering if he would ever reunite with Vargas.
But if you learn our ways, the potential to save him is in your hands.
But this is what they gave us. That was Vexx by Acclaim Entertainment. Overall, yeah, I think I like it. The gameplay brings about a familiar 3D platforming experience but also adds its own twist. The orchestral OST and environments all come together to make a living and breathing atmosphere, with a story that is riveting while still reflecting the simplicity of other platformers of the past. Vexx is a game that I'd call makes the ever so familiar formula of the 3D platformer strange again, for lack of a better word. And yeah, you all should check out this obscure gem. Normally I'd just end it here, but how do you think I did? Oh, that bad, huh?